The worn leather of the armchair seemed to absorb the faint light filtering through the small, cluttered living room. At 70 years old, Eleanor adjusted her glasses, the lenses catching the glow of the lamp, and took a deep breath. The scent of old books and chamomile tea, a constant companion in her life, did little to soothe the tremor in her hands. It had been 30 years since she had left the opulent confines of the Sterling family estate, but the memories, the secrets, the weight of that extraordinary world still lingered, like a faint perfume she couldn't quite shake off. Her life before the Sterlings had been simple, defined by the familiar rhythms of small-town America. She had grown up in rural Vermont, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class family. Her father was a carpenter, and her mother, a seamstress. She had learned early the value of hard work, thrift, and community. She graduated from high school and spent a few years as a teacher's aide before she got married. Her husband, Thomas, was a kind, good-hearted man who worked as a mechanic. Their life together, while not lavish, had been full of contentment and joy. It was the kind of ordinary, uneventful life that Eleanor had always known. But life had a way of changing, even for the most ordinary people. In the early 1980s, when her husband, Thomas, was diagnosed with cancer, Eleanor started working for the Sterlings. Her husband's medical expenses were exorbitant, and she needed to find a job that would pay more than a regular teaching job. She had heard that the Sterlings were looking for a housekeeper, and she applied. She had not expected to be hired. She had not worked as a housekeeper before, but she had always been very organized. She had also always been very discreet. The Sterling family, led by the formidable patriarch, Randolph Sterling, was legendary in the business world, their name synonymous with wealth and power. Randolph had amassed his fortune through a series of shrewd investments and acquisitions, creating a vast empire that spanned several industries, including real estate, finance, and media. His wife, Beatrice, was a woman of impeccable style and grace, a socialite who graced the covers of magazines and sat on the boards of prestigious charitable organizations. They lived in a sprawling estate just outside of the city, a majestic mansion surrounded by manicured lawns, lush gardens, and a private golf course. Eleanor had been hired as a housekeeper, a position that placed her in the heart of the Sterling family's daily life. Over the years, her role had expanded. She became a confidant, a silent observer, a keeper of secrets that were never meant to leave the walls of the estate. She witnessed their lavish parties, their fierce family arguments, and the quiet moments of loneliness and vulnerability that belied their opulent facade. She had never intended to stay for as long as she did, but there was an unspoken agreement between her and the family that she would always be there. She was not part of the family, but she was part of their daily lives. She knew from the very beginning that this was not the life for her. She had always appreciated the simple things, the silence of the early mornings, the smell of the flowers in her garden, the joy of having dinner with her husband. The Sterlings did not have any of that. Their lives were filled with opulence, but they lacked the simple joys. The Sterling children, twins Andrew and Catherine, had been young when Eleanor arrived. They were both in their early teens, and she quickly realized that their life was nothing like that of regular kids. They were raised by nannies and only spent limited time with their parents. They grew up in a world of privilege, their lives shaped by the immense wealth that surrounded them. She had watched them grow up, witnessing their sibling rivalry, their struggles with self-identity, and their constant need for their parents' attention, an attention that was always fleeting and conditional. Andrew, the elder twin by a few minutes, was handsome and charismatic, with a natural aptitude for business. He was groomed to take over the family empire, carrying the weight of his father's expectations on his shoulders. Catherine, on the other hand, was more introverted, with a sensitive and artistic soul. She felt stifled by the strict rules and expectations of her family. She secretly dreamed of a different life, one that was independent of her family's wealth and control. Eleanor could see the pain in both of them, and she often wished she could do more for them, but she was just the housekeeper. Over the years, Eleanor had become privy to many intimate details of the family's life. She had seen the power dynamics, the constant power struggles, the quiet desperation that was hidden beneath the surface of their glamorous facade. She had heard the hushed arguments behind closed doors, witnessed the lavish spending that was used to cover their insecurities, and she had felt the emotional toll that the family's immense wealth exacted on each one of them. She had never judged them or condemned them, but she also could never fully understand their life. She had kept their secrets for years, mostly because she had no one to share them with. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away a few years after she started working for the Sterlings. She had always been very private and discreet. She was also afraid that if she shared the secrets, it could ruin her life or the Sterlings' lives. She knew that the family was used to having control and that they would not be afraid to use their power to make sure she was quiet. Now, 30 years later, after a chance encounter with a young journalist who had shown interest in her years at the Sterling estate, Eleanor had decided to finally share her unique perspective. She felt that it was time to bring the truth to light, to offer a glimpse behind the carefully constructed facade of wealth and power. She wanted to reveal the hidden secrets of the Sterling family. She looked around her modest living room, the antithesis of the opulence she had known for so long. It was now her world, a world that was quiet and simple, yet filled with a quiet grace, a simplicity she appreciated. She was no longer the quiet, watchful housekeeper. She was now ready to tell her story. She took another deep breath, straightened her back, and pressed the record button on the device on her coffee table, ready to delve into the complexities, contradictions, and dark secrets of the billionaire family she had once known so well. The secrets of the Sterlings, she knew, were about to be revealed. The Sterling estate was a world apart, a self-contained universe where the rules of ordinary life seemed to bend to the whims of its inhabitants. Eleanor remembered her first days there, feeling like she had stepped onto a movie set. The sheer scale of the mansion, with its endless hallways, numerous bedrooms, and sprawling gardens, had been overwhelming. The staff, a large and diverse group of people, moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces carefully neutral, their actions precise, knowing their place and staying in their lanes. The family's lifestyle was one of extravagant indulgence. The mansion was filled with priceless artwork, antique furniture, and rare artifacts, each item a testament to their immense wealth. They had several chefs who prepared meals that could rival any five-star restaurant, and a team of gardeners who meticulously maintained the manicured landscape. Weekends were often filled with lavish parties where wealthy guests mingled, sipping champagne and discussing the latest financial deals. She remembered one party where they hired a famous rock band to play in their living room. They also flew out several famous chefs for a special menu. The Sterlings owned several properties around the world, each as lavish as the next. They had a beach house in Malibu, a ski chalet in Aspen, and a penthouse in Manhattan. Private jets were always on standby, ready to whisk them away to any destination at a moment's notice. Eleanor had once overheard them debating which jet to take to Europe. She had never flown anywhere in her life, and she would always be fascinated by their casual conversations about private planes and exotic locations. Their lives were also defined by a constant need to maintain their public image. The Sterlings were very conscious of how they were perceived by others, and they took great pains to cultivate an image of sophistication, power, and success. They were always on the lookout for any potential scandal that could tarnish their reputation, and they had a team of public relations experts who carefully crafted their public statements and appearances. They were always aware of who was watching, and they were very conscious of their behavior in public. She remembered how strict Randolph was when they had people in the house. Everything had to be perfect. He did not tolerate mistakes, and she always felt pressure to make sure everything was in its place. Behind the veneer of perfection, the family dynamics were often tense and strained. Randolph was a domineering figure, his word law, his control absolute. He ruled the family with an iron fist, demanding loyalty and obedience from everyone, including his wife and children. He had a very narrow view of how his family should act, and he would always enforce it with a harsh tone and veiled threats. Eleanor had often seen how both Beatrice and her children walked on eggshells around him. They always seemed afraid of his rage. Beatrice, while appearing composed in public, was deeply unhappy. She was a woman of culture and intelligence, but she was trapped in a gilded cage, her voice often silenced by her husband's overbearing personality. She spent most of her time attending charity events or organizing lavish parties, using social engagement as a way to cope with her loneliness. She would sometimes talk to Eleanor, sharing some of her frustrations, but they were always brief, and Beatrice would always ask her to keep the conversations private. The twins, Andrew and Catherine, were locked in a constant rivalry, their relationship complicated by their parents' expectations and the pressure to compete for their father's approval. Andrew, the heir apparent, felt the weight of his father's expectations, knowing that his every move was scrutinized. He desperately craved his father's love and approval, but he also resented the constant pressure to conform to his father's narrow definition of success. He would often work long hours to please his father, but it was never enough. He always had the feeling that his father could see through his charade and see the person he really was. Catherine, rebellious and independent, yearned to escape the confines of her privileged world. She secretly dreamed of a life where she could pursue her artistic passions, free from the constraints of her family's expectations. She had enrolled in art school, but her father would always make fun of her paintings, and he would constantly pressure her to come back to his company. Eleanor had become fond of Catherine, as she felt compassion for this young woman who was being held captive by her family's expectations. The family's lavish spending was often a source of conflict. Eleanor had witnessed countless arguments about budgets, personal expenses, and the allocation of family resources. The Sterlings spent money freely, often on unnecessary and extravagant things. They collected vintage cars, art, and antiques. They would buy multiple houses in different locations, even if they were only planning on staying there for a couple of days. She had seen them pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for something that they simply did not need, almost as if money was nothing more than a game to them. She remembered one incident where Andrew had bought a rare vintage car for over $1 million, only to have his father criticize his choice and demand that he return it. The car was returned the next day, and she never saw it again. She realized that the money was only part of it. It was the power and the control that was more important to Randolph. Money, for him, was just a tool. The children's relationships with their parents were strained. Their mother was mostly absent, busy with her charities and social events, and their father was mostly preoccupied with his business empire. He would call and yell at them, but he would rarely show them any affection or genuine interest. The children always seemed to be vying for their father's attention and approval, a competition that seemed to have no real winner. Eleanor also noticed that the children had a strained relationship with each other. They were constantly comparing themselves to each other and trying to win their parents' affections. Their rivalry was a constant battle, with no end in sight. They seemed to be more interested in undermining the other than being partners. It was clear to Eleanor that their lives, despite the opulence, were filled with loneliness, tension, and a constant struggle for connection. The Sterlings' wealth, she realized, had created a barrier, isolating them from the real world. They seemed to live in a bubble, their lives defined by privilege, power, and a constant struggle to maintain an image of perfection. They had very little understanding of other people's lives, and often seemed to have a total disregard for how other people lived. It was this detachment from reality that, Eleanor felt, created much of the unhappiness she had witnessed over the years. The secrets of the Sterlings, she realized, were as complex and layered as the opulent world they inhabited. She knew there was so much more to reveal, and she was now ready to talk about it. Beneath the surface of the Sterlings' lavish lifestyle, there was a deep undercurrent of emotional turmoil. Eleanor had often observed the loneliness and isolation that permeated their lives, despite their vast wealth and extensive social circles. She realized that the immense fortune that surrounded them had created a barrier, making genuine human connection difficult. They were constantly surrounded by people, but they were often alone, and they were usually unhappy. The emotional toll of their wealth was evident in the constant anxiety that plagued them. They were always worried about losing their money, their power, their position in society. They seemed to be living in constant fear, always on guard against any potential threat, be it financial, social, or even personal. She had often seen Randolph pacing in his office late at night, worrying about a business deal. She had also seen Beatrice crying alone in her room because she had just been scolded by Randolph for spending too much money. She had also seen the children secretly crying at night, feeling the weight of their parents' expectations. Their relationships with others were often strained. They seemed to find it difficult to relate to people who were not part of their privileged world. They had a hard time connecting with their employees, their friends, and even their own extended family. They always had a hard time trusting anyone, always assuming that everyone had an ulterior motive. She had witnessed many instances where they had been betrayed, and they had become cynical and bitter. She was often shocked by their lack of empathy. They had very few genuine friendships. Most of the people they associated with were either other wealthy families or business partners, all of them trying to use the Sterlings' power and influence to their own advantage. Eleanor had often heard them criticize their friends behind their backs. She realized that their world was filled with superficial relationships, where genuine emotional connections were rare. They were constantly surrounded by people, but they were often alone. The family members often made great sacrifices in their quest for financial success and social status. Randolph had devoted his entire life to his business, often sacrificing his family life and his own personal well-being for the sake of his empire. He had made many enemies, and he lived with constant threats. He had even hired a team of bodyguards, as he constantly feared for his life. He was consumed by his power, and he seemed to have no time for anything else. Beatrice had sacrificed her own passions and aspirations, living a life dictated by her husband's demands. She had once been a very accomplished painter, but she had given it all up when she married Randolph. She had always felt that she had never lived the life she wanted, and that her marriage had been a mistake. She had become increasingly cynical over the years, spending most of her time shopping or at social events, always trying to distract herself from the reality of her life. Andrew and Catherine had both sacrificed their personal lives for the sake of the family business. They were constantly under pressure to perform well at their jobs, always trying to earn their father's approval. They had very little time for their own personal interests, and they often felt stifled and constrained. They had a hard time forming close relationships. The few times that they tried, it always ended in heartbreak. It was as if they had a curse on their head. The constant scrutiny and the pressure to maintain their public image took a toll on all of them. They were always conscious of their appearance, their behavior, their words. They lived in constant fear of making a mistake or doing something that would tarnish their family's reputation. They were always afraid of being judged, and they always felt pressure to be perfect. She had often seen them rehearsing public statements or practicing their speeches in front of a mirror. The Sterlings had very little time for each other. They were often traveling to different cities or countries, and they rarely had the opportunity to spend quality time together. Even when they were all under the same roof, they were often preoccupied with their own affairs, and they rarely engaged in meaningful conversations. They seemed to be living their lives in parallel to each other, almost as strangers. Their relationships with their extended family were also strained, characterized by a mixture of jealousy, resentment, and strained politeness. Most of their family members were constantly asking for money or trying to take advantage of their position. The Sterlings had learned to keep their distance, avoiding them as much as possible. She knew that the extended family members secretly hated them and were constantly making fun of them behind their backs. Eleanor had always tried to maintain a neutral stance, providing support and kindness whenever possible, while keeping a professional distance. She would often have private conversations with Beatrice, and she had a special affection for Catherine. She would listen to their frustrations and their fears. She tried to be there for them as much as possible. She had seen that they desperately needed someone to listen and to offer them some support. She had witnessed countless arguments, breakdowns, and emotional outbursts. all of which had reinforced her belief that the cost of their success had been extraordinarily high. She had seen the darkness, the sadness, and the emptiness that were always lurking behind the glamour. The life they presented to the public was all an act, and it had very little to do with the reality that she had witnessed and that she had tried to understand. The Sterlings, she understood, were not happy. They were a family who had everything money could buy, but they lacked the simple joys, the emotional connections, and the genuine human interactions that truly mattered. Their wealth had not brought them happiness. It had instead become a cage, trapping them in a gilded prison and isolating them from the real world. The secrets of the Sterlings, she knew, went far beyond the lavish parties and the expensive objects. The secrets were embedded in their emotional life, in their struggles to find connections, and in their desperation to be loved. These were the secrets she was now ready to share. Despite the complexities and challenges of their lives, the Sterling family members were, at their core, human beings with their own set of fears, insecurities, and emotional vulnerabilities. Eleanor had always seen beyond their wealth and privilege, recognizing the universal struggles that bound them together. She knew that underneath their expensive clothing, behind their perfectly manicured faces, there were real people, facing complex human problems. Randolph, despite his domineering public persona, was deeply insecure. He always needed to be in control, because he always felt as if everything was about to fall apart. His vast empire was built on his ability to manage his financial life, but it did not apply to his personal life. He always had a hard time with his emotions. He constantly feared losing his power or his relevance, and he desperately sought validation from others, although he would never admit it. His anger and his rage, Eleanor realized, were often a cover for his deep-seated fears. Beatrice, beneath her elegant facade, yearned for genuine connection and love. She was deeply unhappy, and she felt very much alone. She had given up her own dreams for the sake of her family, and she deeply regretted her decision. She often confided in Eleanor about her feelings of emptiness, loneliness, and lack of purpose. She often felt that her life was meaningless, and she had a hard time finding a reason to be alive. She secretly longed for a life where she could express her creativity, and she would often ask Eleanor for ideas about her paintings. Andrew, despite his ambition and drive, constantly questioned his own worth. He always felt that he was not good enough for his father, and he desperately sought his approval. He constantly strived to be the ideal heir to his father's empire, but he secretly wished that he could just have his own life. He felt that he was constantly under scrutiny, always trying to earn his father's respect. He would work endless hours, but he would never feel that it was enough. He would often talk to Eleanor about his feeling of inadequacy. Catherine, despite her rebellious nature, craved her parents' love and attention, which she rarely got. She always felt that she was not being heard. She knew that she had to get away from her family if she wanted to have a life of her own. But she always felt the guilt of not conforming to her parents' expectations. She was afraid of hurting them, and she would often get frustrated at her own inaction. Eleanor felt a strong connection to Catherine, as she saw a lot of herself in the young woman. Eleanor had observed these vulnerabilities over the years, and she had come to understand the complex interplay between wealth, privilege, and human emotions. She had learned that money could not buy happiness, and that in many ways, it could actually isolate people from true connections. She had also realized that even the wealthiest families were not immune to human problems. They still had the same fears, the same insecurities, and the same emotional needs as everyone else. Working for the Sterling family had taught Eleanor several valuable lessons about the true nature of wealth and its impact on human relationships. She had learned that humility, gratitude, and genuine emotional connection were far more valuable than money, status, and social acceptance. She had also learned that success and happiness were not always correlated, and that the pursuit of wealth could often lead to emptiness and isolation. She had learned to appreciate the simple things in life, like her small house, her beautiful garden, and the quiet evenings with a book and a cup of tea. She had also learned the value of true friendship and the importance of kindness and empathy. Her interaction with the Sterlings had given her a unique perspective on life, and she often thought about the lessons she had learned and what she could have done differently. She had often pondered the role of wealth in society, and she had come to the conclusion that while it could provide comfort and opportunity, it could also be a source of great suffering. She believed that it was important to strike a balance between material wealth and personal well-being, and to prioritize relationships and emotional connection over material possessions. She had seen firsthand that money had the potential of corrupting even the most well-intentioned people. She had also learned that it was crucial to look beyond the external appearances and to seek to understand the inner struggles of others. She felt that everyone had their own stories, and everyone deserved to be treated with respect and compassion. She tried to bring this lesson to her daily life. She knew that people were often struggling with private issues, and she tried to see everyone with compassion. Now, as she was sharing her story with the world, Eleanor hoped that her unique perspective could offer a valuable insight into the complex lives of the ultra-wealthy and the impact of immense wealth on relationships. She wanted people to realize that money was not everything, and that true happiness was found in human connections, kindness, and gratitude. She also wanted people to know that even the wealthiest families had their own set of problems, and that they were not immune to human suffering. She hoped that people would treat them with compassion rather than with judgment. She felt that everyone deserved to be treated with respect and empathy, regardless of their social status. Eleanor was ready to bring her story to a conclusion. She looked into the camera, and she smiled. She was now ready to share her thoughts and her feelings, and she was ready to start a conversation. She had kept the secrets for 30 years, and she was now ready to let them go. She was ready to be a voice for the people who had no voice. She was not afraid to tell her truth, no matter the consequences. She was ready to live the rest of her life with honesty and transparency. She took a deep breath, her voice firm and steady, and shared her final thoughts. I have learned, through my years of service, that true wealth is not measured in money or material possessions. It's measured in the richness of our relationships, in our capacity for kindness, and in our ability to connect with each other on a genuine human level. The Sterlings, I believe, missed that important lesson, and they paid the price. I hope that my story will serve as a reminder that true happiness is found in humility, gratitude, and meaningful connections. With that final thought, Eleanor paused, a sense of peace washing over her as she concluded her story. The secrets of the billionaire family, she knew, had finally been revealed.